She was the favorite daughter until a DNA test revealed the truth. There was a ritual to every Sunday dinner at the Calloway house, one that had been performed with such consistency over the years that it no longer needed direction. The table was always set precisely 15 minutes before 6, with the bone-white plates edged in gold trim that Mother insisted were too elegant for everyday use, but just right for family. Father would descend from his study at 6 on the dot, a single cough announcing his arrival before he took his seat at the head of the table. And somewhere between the roast being carved and the green tea being poured, she, Vivian, the favorite, would regale the family with stories that hovered between boast and fairy tale. Her achievements sparkled like centerpieces, valedictorian accolades, offers from Ivy League institutions, compliments from professors and bosses who adored her, even strangers who noticed her unmistakable aura of excellence. And always, our parents would listen with their eyes gleaming like freshly shined silverware, nodding in agreement with every word, as though she were the very sun around which we orbited. I, meanwhile, passed the peas in silence. My name is Lila. You probably haven't heard it said much in the Calloway household, except maybe when someone was shouting for help carrying groceries, or needed a +1 for a boring event. I wasn't mistreated, per se. That would have required attention, even if negative. No, I was simply there, an afterthought in a family that had already decided who their star was. Vivian was born glowing, they said. So calm, so beautiful, so bright. Even as a baby she had this presence. I apparently had colic and eczema and a habit of crying too much. One summer, a family friend visiting from New York leaned in at a barbecue and whispered to my mother, not softly enough, "That one, Vivienne, she's going to run the world. The other one, what's her name again?" Still, I tried. I joined the same clubs she once led, auditioned for the same school plays where she had shown, submitted essays to contests that had once handed her trophies. But each effort felt like dressing up in clothes that didn't fit, performing a version of someone I was told I should be. Nothing stuck. Nothing earned the glimmer in my parents' eyes that came so effortlessly when Vivian spoke, smiled, or even just stood still. They loved me, I suppose, in the same way you love the back porch light, not because it dazzles, but because it's familiar and doesn't ask much. So I stopped asking. I forged a life of small, quiet victories, grades that were decent, friends who didn't care about lineage, and part-time jobs that taught me more about people than any honors course ever could. I didn't bring these things home. What was the point? They weren't the currency of love in the Calloway house. No, love there was traded for brilliance, for charm, for accolades printed in local papers. I had none of those, and so I became fluent in invisibility. Everything changed the week Vivian bought a DNA test kit. It was one of those promotional things, buy one get one deals designed for bored millennials curious about their ancestral breakdowns. She brought it up at dinner like it was nothing, laughing at the thought of discovering we were secretly 12% Viking or something. Our father chuckled. Our mother smiled a little too tightly, but nothing seemed out of place. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? Vivian had always belonged. I was the one who sometimes wondered if I'd been dropped off by mistake. She took the test. She sent it in. Life went on, until 3 weeks later when everything didn't. It started with whispers. Our mother stopped setting the table early. Our father took calls behind closed doors. One afternoon, I came home to find Vivian sitting on the floor of her room, papers spread around her like the aftermath of a storm, her phone buzzing endlessly beside her. She didn't look up when I stepped in, just held a piece of paper in her hand like it had personally betrayed her. It was the DNA report. I glanced at it without meaning to, and what I saw didn't immediately register. Just numbers, percentages, matches, unmatches. But her name, Vivian Calloway, was followed by a series of words that hit like a stray match in a gas-filled room. No close biological parental match found. "Viv," I said cautiously. She looked up. Her eyes were raw. "I'm not their daughter." The room spun. I said nothing. What could I say? "They adopted me," she said, voice cracking under the weight of its own disbelief. "And they never told me." The rest of that night passed in fractured pieces. Raised voices, muffled sobs, doors opening and slamming. I didn't see my parents until the next morning. and when I did, my mother's eyes looked like glass about to break. My father was uncharacteristically silent. The truth poured out in jagged bits. A closed adoption, complicated paperwork, secrecy to protect her, promises made and never revisited. They swore they had loved her the same, swore she was theirs in every way that mattered. But the damage was already done. Vivienne looked lost, like someone had ripped the foundation out from under her and she had nothing solid to land on. And suddenly I, the invisible one, the spare daughter, became the only one who belonged. What followed was a strange sort of unraveling. The pedestal Vivienne had stood on so long cracked beneath her feet. Family friends stopped calling to ask about her job. Distant relatives whispered when she entered the room. She withdrew from social media, skipped dinners, spoke less. And when she did speak, her words were heavy with disbelief. Was it all fake? She'd ask. Was I just their project? Their prize? I didn't know how to answer. For years I had envied her certainty, her position, her pedestal. But now that it had crumbled, I found no joy in the wreckage, only confusion. Because if Vivienne wasn't their real daughter, if she had been the interloper all along, then what had that made me? The backup plan? The disappointment they had to keep just to balance the equation? Our parents tried at first to restore the balance. They tried to insist nothing had changed, that biology didn't alter love. But something had changed. Something irreversible. And it wasn't just in Vivienne, it was in me. For the first time, I saw them clearly. Not as gods of a household, but as fallible people who had chosen to withhold the most essential truth from the daughter they claimed to cherish. I wondered what else they had lied about. I wondered if they had ever really seen me, or if they had simply been too busy polishing the crown on someone else's head. In the weeks that followed, our home became a theater of quiet resentments. Conversations grew shorter. Meals were taken at separate times. The silence between Vivienne and our parents turned into a chasm no apology could cross. She began staying out late, talking about moving out, changing her last name. And I began to breathe. Not because I was happy she was hurting. I wasn't. But because no one was looking past me. I wasn't the backup singer anymore. I had a solo, and the stage, however broken, was finally mine. But the truth has a way of complicating victories. Because as Vivienne's world collapsed, she began searching for pieces of herself elsewhere. Digging through old records, hunting for clues about her birth parents. And one afternoon, she found something. Something that made her knock on my bedroom door, eyes wide and terrified. "There's something you need to see," she said. And that, dear reader, is where this story truly begins. The folder she held in her hand didn't look extraordinary. It was weathered, its corners curled as if it had sat unnoticed in a box for years, maybe decades. The label on it was faded and written in pen, VL Adoption Documents. That was all. But her fingers trembled as she gripped it, knuckles bone white. I could feel the tension radiating from her like a storm, rolling in over a calm sea. Inevitable. Dark. Electric. I had never seen Vivienne look uncertain before. Not in school, not during speeches, not even during those theatrical family holiday dinners where the room bent around her charisma. But now she stood in the hallway like a stranger, stripped of her golden light, all polish gone. Her voice was flat when she spoke. "I found this in the back of the attic closet, stuffed behind a suitcase. I don't think they meant for me to ever see it." I gestured for her to come in. We sat on the edge of my bed, two sisters who had never really shared much of anything. Not secrets, not laughs, not even closeness. Our childhoods had coexisted but rarely overlapped. And yet, in that moment, it felt as though the walls built over a lifetime were crumbling. Not from warmth or reconciliation, but from the force of too many truths finally refusing to stay buried. She opened the folder slowly, carefully, as if afraid the contents would explode on contact. Inside were several yellowing sheets of paper, legal forms, hospital discharge summaries, a letter from a private adoption agency in Chicago. Everything about her past laid bare in sterile, bureaucratic text. "They adopted me from a woman named Julia Lee," she said, her voice barely audible. "She was 19, no father listed." I leaned in. The paperwork didn't mention much else. The adoption seemed above board, No signs of coercion or foul play. But one detail caught my eye. Closed adoption. Conditions. Anonymity. No future contact. Permanent sealing of records. Vivian swallowed hard. They never wanted her to find me, or for me to find her. Silence stretched between us. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? My entire life had been spent trying to understand why I was always second, always eclipsed. Now here was the answer. Vivian wasn't chosen for her talent or beauty. She was chosen through circumstance, maybe even convenience. That revelation should have given me a perverse satisfaction, a sense of justice finally being served. But it didn't. It just made everything murkier. She flipped to the last page. There's more. It was a letter, handwritten, dated the same year Vivian was born, addressed simply to the parents who will raise my daughter. The handwriting was delicate, looping, with the kind of purposeful flourishes that suggested it had been written slowly, with intent. If you're reading this, it means you've taken her into your home. Thank you. I hope she has your eyes, or your smile, or something that makes her feel like she belongs. I don't want her to grow up feeling like an outsider. Please, I beg you, don't keep her origins from her forever. Truth hurts, yes, but lies rot everything from the inside out. Love her. But tell her when the time is right. Please. There was no signature, just a single smudged fingerprint at the bottom. Vivian stared at it for a long time. They promised they'd tell me, and they didn't. The betrayal in her voice was sharp, cutting, raw. I felt it in my own chest, too. Not because I had known, but because I hadn't. I'd lived in the same house, breathed the same air, watched the same woman be fawned over and revered. But I had never been let in, not to the truth, not even to the lie. I'm going to find her, Vivian said, looking at me now with eyes made of steel. Julia Lee, my real mother. I need to know who I am. It was the first time she had ever sounded unsure of her identity, and for a moment, I forgot our history. I forgot the years of competition and cold shoulders and the way I had been made to feel small in her presence. I just saw my sister, lost, fractured, adrift, and I nodded. Then let's find her. What followed was not easy. Closed adoptions are designed to be untraceable, a maze of sealed court orders, anonymized agencies, and redacted documents. But Vivian was relentless. She called every phone number she could find, filed petitions, hired a private investigator with money she had quietly saved from her job. I offered to help however I could, but she insisted on doing most of the digging herself. Maybe it was her way of taking control of something that had always been kept from her. 3 weeks into the search, she got a hit. Julia Lee, now Julia Darnell. Age, 41. Living in a modest suburb outside Milwaukee, married, 2 kids, a public Facebook profile that hadn't been updated in a year, but enough information to confirm it was her. Vivian didn't react the way I expected. She didn't cry. She didn't jump for joy. She simply sat still, phone in hand, and stared at Julia's profile picture. A smiling woman with short auburn hair, standing in front of a tree. Ordinary, unassuming, and yet holding the key to everything Vivian had never known. I need to see her, she said quietly. I offered to drive. The house was small but charming. Red shutters, a tire swing, flower beds that needed weeding, the kind of home that suggested warmth, history, maybe a little chaos. As we pulled up, Vivian's fingers gripped the door handle so tightly her knuckles turned ghostly. She wore no makeup. Her hair was pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked nothing like the perfectly manicured woman our parents had raised. She looked real. I don't know what I'll say, she murmured. You'll figure it out. She nodded once, then stepped out of the car. I waited by the curb. From where I sat, I could see the entire exchange unfold like a silent film. Vivian walked up the path, rang the bell. A woman, presumably Julia, opened the door. There was a pause, a tilt of the head. Words exchanged. Then a hand raised to a mouth. Another step forward. And then, as if gravity had shifted, they both collapsed into each other's arms. I looked away, gave them privacy. The sun had begun to dip low in the sky by the time Vivian returned to the car. Her face was flushed, eyes puffy but shining. "She remembered me," she said. "She always remembered me." Tears welled in her voice, but she didn't sob. Just exhaled like she had been holding her breath for 25 years. She wanted to keep me, but her parents made her give me up. She never stopped thinking about me. My throat tightened. I reached out and squeezed her hand. She didn't pull away. In the weeks that followed, something began to shift. Vivian started visiting Julia regularly, not in a way that meant abandoning our family, but in a way that redefined her sense of self. She met her half-siblings, started asking questions about her heritage, shared childhood photos and funny stories. It was like watching her rebuild the foundation of who she was, not as the perfect daughter of the Callaways, but as the true daughter of someone who had loved her in silence for so long. Back home, our parents flailed. My mother tried to pretend everything was fine. My father grew quieter, more withdrawn. They invited Vivian to dinner, but the meals were hollow, filled with forced conversation and false smiles. The tension was no longer between her and me. It was between her and them, and they didn't know how to bridge the gap they had created. One evening, I found my father in the backyard, nursing a glass of scotch, staring at the old oak tree he used to push us on the swing beneath. "She still hasn't forgiven us," he muttered. "Would you?" I asked. He didn't respond. It was the first time I saw the cost of his choices etched in the lines of his face. Not regret, exactly, but the realization that he could no longer control the narrative. The family he had curated so carefully was unraveling, thread by thread. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening between Vivian and me. We started talking. Really talking. She'd come into my room late at night and collapse on my bed, recounting stories from her visits with Julia. I told her things I'd never admitted before. How it felt growing up in her shadow. How I learned to fade into the wallpaper just to avoid disappointment. She listened, apologized, shared her own pressures. How being the favorite never felt like a gift, only a standard she was terrified of falling below. "I was never allowed to be average," she said one night, staring at the ceiling. "I didn't even know who I was. I just became who they wanted me to be." And in that moment, we both realized we had been victims of the same machine. Two girls on opposite ends of a spectrum neither of us asked to be placed on. The pedestal, the shadows. They were both prisons. And now, for the first time, we were breaking free. But just as the dust was settling, the second secret landed like a bomb. I came home from work one evening to find my mother in the kitchen, clutching a letter with trembling hands. Her face was pale, shaken. "I think you should see this," she said, pushing the envelope toward me. It was addressed to Lila Calloway. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a test result, but not Vivian's, mine, and at the bottom, in stark black letters, paternity, not a match. The ground shifted under me. Everything tilted. I looked up at her, heart hammering in my chest. "What is this?" I whispered. She looked as if she might crumble. Her voice was brittle. "It was a mistake. A long time ago. I thought it wouldn't matter." My legs gave out. I sank into a chair, paper still in hand, and tried to breathe. Vivian wasn't the only one with secrets. I wasn't my father's daughter either. The world didn't end the day I discovered I wasn't my father's daughter, but it tilted just enough to make every memory feel like a hallucination. I sat at the kitchen table long after my mother had retreated upstairs, letter still trembling in my hands, as though holding it might somehow clarify the absurdity. The paper was unassuming, just a standard lab result with a header from some anonymous clinic, but its contents tore through the air like shrapnel. Paternity. Not a match, not a maybe, not a technicality, just cold, calculated certainty. At first, my mind resisted the truth. I replayed birthdays, holidays, father-daughter dances at school, the way he taught me to ride a bike, the nights he sat on the floor of my room building dollhouses with aching knees, the soft-spoken pride he would wear after school plays, even if I only had 2 lines. Those memories felt sacred. Surely blood couldn't undo them. Surely one DNA test couldn't fracture the invisible thread that bound parent and child. And yet, here I was, realizing that all my life, I had looked at that man and never once questioned whether he was mine. The irony twisted deep into my gut like a knife with no handle. I had spent so many years envying Vivian. Her place in the family, the warmth she received, the validation she never had to earn. And then her whole world detonated. She wasn't theirs. She was adopted. A stranger in the house she once thought was her own. And now me. Lila, the afterthought daughter, the biological child, wasn't even related to the man who raised me. I didn't cry that night, not because I wasn't devastated, but because I couldn't yet decipher the shape of the devastation. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff and not knowing how deep the drop was, only that the ground beneath had vanished. When I finally mustered the strength to climb the stairs, I found my mother sitting in the hallway, knees tucked beneath her like a child in timeout. Her eyes were swollen, skin sallow, a half-empty glass of tea trembling beside her. "I was young," she whispered, as if the house had ears. "Barely out of college. Your father and I were distant back then. It was one mistake. I didn't even know I was pregnant until weeks later, and when the doctor said the timeline was uncertain, I made a decision." I stared at her, not with hatred, but with a hollow kind of disbelief. "So you lied. I raised you. We both did. With love, but not with truth." She closed her eyes. "I thought it wouldn't matter. I thought it would never come up. And her voice cracked. "I never told your father." It was like being sucker-punched in the chest. "He doesn't know?" She shook her head. "He believes you're his. He always has." Something inside me splintered. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was disoriented. What did this mean for my entire existence? What did it mean for our family? "You have to tell him," I said, the words clawing their way out of my throat. Her eyes pleaded. "Please, Lila, don't make me. I'm not the one who made this mess." She reached for me, but I recoiled. For once, the woman who always had the answers, the control, the script, was completely unraveling. I left her there in the hallway, sobbing into her knees. The next day, the house was steeped in a suffocating silence. I avoided my father like he was a living landmine, every word a potential detonation. He made waffles, asked about work, complimented the sunshine. Meanwhile, I sat across from him knowing that the man who loved me didn't know he wasn't mine. I considered blurting it out right then, shattering the illusion. But I couldn't. I couldn't be the one to break him. Not yet. So instead I drove. I drove for hours, past the city limits, past the farmlands that stretched like green oceans, past any place that felt remotely familiar. My brain buzzed with noise, and all I wanted was to feel small beneath a wide sky and forget that my life had become a cruel case study in identity crises. Eventually, I found myself outside Julia's house. I hadn't planned to go there. I hadn't even texted Vivian, but the car had taken me, almost as if guided by some subconscious instinct to find someone, anyone who understood what it felt like to have your roots yanked out from beneath you. Julia opened the door before I could knock. "Lila?" "I'm sorry," I said, not sure what for. I didn't know where else to go. She ushered me inside with a kindness that felt foreign. Her home was warm, lived in. Photographs cluttered the mantel, toys scattered across the carpet. A coffee mug sat half-drunk on the counter, its contents cold. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just waited. So I told her everything. Every word, every secret, every crack in the carefully curated facade that was my family. I watched her face tighten with each revelation, watched empathy bloom and then wither under the weight of it. "I thought I was the real one," I said bitterly, "and now I don't even know who I am." She reached out and held my hand. "Blood doesn't define reality, Lila. Choices do. And from everything I've seen, your father, regardless of DNA, chose to be yours. I can't even look at him now. Not without guilt." "Guilt for what? For existing?" I looked down. She squeezed my fingers. "You are not your mother's choices. You are your own person." We sat in silence, just breathing, and for a brief moment, the ache inside me dulled. Vivienne called that night. "I know," she said, her voice low. I didn't ask how. Of course she knew. We were tethered now, not by rivalry, not by resentment, but by the shared trauma of discovering we were living versions of someone else's secret. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Number, but I'm surviving." There was a pause. Same. She hesitated before speaking again. You know what's messed up? For years I thought being the favorite meant I was special. Now, I think it just meant I was easier to love because I wasn't complicated. Because I came with no baggage, no expectations. I was a blank canvas they could paint their own story onto. And I was the stain they couldn't scrub out. Don't say that. It's how it feels. Another silence. Then, maybe we were both props in their version of the perfect family. Characters in a play they wrote to impress the neighbors. I almost laughed. Too bad we burned the script. Maybe it's time we write our own. Over the next few weeks, our family devolved into quiet war. My mother avoided eye contact. My father remained blissfully ignorant. Vivienne kept her visits with Julia going strong. And I became a ghost inside my own life, floating through conversations, dodging emotions, pretending everything was fine while feeling like my insides were made of glass. The final fracture came one rainy afternoon. I came home early from work and heard raised voices in the kitchen. My mother and father. I saw the test, Meredith, he was saying. His voice, usually steady, calm, was raw. I found it in your drawer. She tried to lie. I heard her voice rise in panic. It's not what you think. But he cut her off. Don't insult me with more deception. There was a pause. Then I heard the sound I would never forget. The sound of something breaking. A glass, maybe. Or maybe it was just his heart. 25 years, Meredith, he whispered. I loved her like she was mine. I would have died for her. And you, his voice caught. You let me live a lie. I didn't hear what she said next. I didn't need to. I backed away from the door and fled the house before anyone saw me. I drove straight to Vivienne's place, the rain smearing across my windshield like tears I hadn't yet cried. She opened the door in pajamas, hair unkempt. Lila? They know, I said. She didn't ask who. She just let me in. That night we sat on her floor, surrounded by takeout and unanswered questions, two sisters finally stripped of all pretense. Not the golden child and the shadow, not the real and the adopted, just two girls trying to figure out how to survive the fallout of a truth that had spared no one. What now? She asked. I didn't have an answer, but I knew this much. We weren't going back to who we were. There was no pedestal left, only the rubble. And maybe from that rubble we could build something real. No one ever teaches you how to mourn something intangible, something that didn't die, but simply unraveled in the light. Grief usually follows death, closure, finality. But this grief, the kind that comes from learning the blueprint of your life was a forgery, had no clean boundaries. It didn't begin or end. It simmered, constant and sour, like a low-grade fever beneath the skin. Every day I woke up in the house I had grown up in and felt like a stranger squatting in someone else's memories. The fallout of my father discovering the truth had rippled through the house like a quiet nuclear blast. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things or leave in a rage. He simply shut down, retreating into a silence so absolute that it felt like a death knell. He moved into the guest room. The door was always shut. My mother tiptoed around like a servant in her own home, her usual imperious composure stripped down to a nervous, jittering woman who looked over her shoulder at shadows she used to command. And I wandered through the halls like a living artifact. I didn't belong to them, not fully, not anymore. Vivienne, ironically, was the only one who seemed more rooted now than ever. Losing her perceived biological tie had liberated something in her. She wasn't playing the role anymore. She wasn't the golden child trying to live up to expectations crafted by two people who had projected all their dreams onto her. She was just Vivienne, adopted, angry, curious, and perhaps, for the first time, completely free. It was she who suggested we leave. Not forever, just for a while. Come stay with me, she said one morning over the phone. The house is big enough. And frankly, being around Mom right now feels like suffocating in broken glass. I hesitated. I wasn't sure if leaving would be an escape or a surrender. But when I walked past the guest room and saw my father's silhouette sitting motionless in the dark, I realized I didn't have anything to hold on to here, not anymore. Vivienne's house had always felt cold to me before. Too polished, too curated like a showroom rather than a home. But now it felt different. Lived in. Human. There were dishes in the sink and blankets tossed carelessly across the couch. Books left open mid-page. For the first time, I felt welcome. She gave me the guest room, but we rarely stayed apart. Most nights we curled up on the couch with tea and old movies, falling asleep with the TV still glowing. The silence between us, once filled with envy and judgment, had softened into something that resembled comfort. One night, a week into my stay, she asked the question that had been clawing at the edges of my thoughts since this all began. "Do you want to find him?" It took me a moment to realize what she meant. My biological father. The man my mother had referred to only once, in a broken whisper. It was a mistake. I shrugged, trying to sound indifferent. What would be the point? Vivienne looked at me, her gaze unblinking. Closure? Curiosity? Justice? I scoffed. What justice is there in hunting down a man who probably doesn't even know I exist? She didn't answer. She just sipped her tea and looked out the window. But the seed had been planted. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining a man who looked like me. Not my father, the one who raised me, taught me to ride a bike, took me to soccer games, but someone else. A ghost with my eyes. A stranger who unknowingly gave me half of my DNA and then disappeared into the ether of my mother's silence. I got up, padded into the kitchen, and opened my laptop. I didn't know what I was looking for. A name, a face, a decade-old affair resurrected by a keyboard and Google's omniscience? Instead, I found myself logging into the very same ancestry site Vivienne had used. I submitted for another DNA kit. A week passed before it arrived. Another week before the results came in. And then there it was, under biological matches. A name I didn't recognize, listed as a potential close relative, possibly a half-sibling. I stared at it for a long time. The name was Elias Blackwood, masculine, sharp, unmistakable, and completely foreign to me. I didn't message him right away. For days, I hovered over the contact button, my finger twitching, heart racing. What did one even say in a situation like this? Hi, you might be my brother? Sorry to interrupt your life, but I'm the result of an affair our father never told you about. Eventually, I wrote a simple message. Hi, Elias. I know this might come as a surprise, but based on our DNA match, it seems we might be half-siblings. I'm not looking to disrupt anything in your life. I just wanted to reach out and see if you were open to talking. Best, Lila. I hit send and immediately closed the laptop like it might explode. 3 days passed. Then he replied, Lila, wow, this is a lot. I had no idea. I don't even know how to process this yet. But yes, I'd like to talk. Maybe meet, if you're comfortable. I'm in the city. Let me know what works. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before responding. We met in a quiet cafe tucked into a corner of downtown, the kind of place with cracked leather booths and music low enough that you could hear yourself think. He was already there when I arrived. Early 30s, tall, sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges, sharp green eyes that flicked up the moment the door opened. I saw the resemblance instantly, in the eyes, the jaw, the way he tapped his fingers when he was nervous. Lila? He asked, standing up. I nodded, and he smiled. Nervous, but genuine. We sat. The conversation was awkward at first. Polite, careful. We talked about jobs, hobbies, music tastes, anything to avoid the elephant sitting between us wearing our DNA like a badge. Eventually I told him everything, or at least the parts that mattered. My mother never told my dad. I didn't even know until a few weeks ago. Everything I thought I knew about my family just dissolved. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight. My dad was a traveling consultant, he said quietly. He was gone a lot, but he always came back. At least, that's what I thought. He didn't need to say the rest. If I was born from an affair, then his father had betrayed 2 families, mine and his. I saw the pain flicker behind his eyes, not for me, but for the man he had looked up to, now rewritten by a single DNA test and a stranger's face. I'm sorry, I whispered, and I meant it. I'm not, he said after a moment. I'm angry, but I'm glad I know. I'd rather have the ugly truth than a pretty lie. And just like that, something shifted between us. We weren't strangers anymore. We were 2 sides of the same secret. Vivienne was waiting when I returned home. I told her everything. She listened, wide-eyed, and then smiled in that slow, sad way that only people who've been betrayed know how to. "You found your truth," she said. "I found another lie. But you found it. That matters." I looked at her, truly looked at her. The sister who wasn't really my sister, and yet somehow, the only person who felt like home. "We should tell him," I said. She blinked. "Tell who?" "Dad. He deserves the truth. All of it." Vivienne hesitated. "He's already shattered." I nodded. "Then let's stop pretending we can keep him whole. He deserves to make his own choices, with the full story." And that's how we decided to detonate the last lie. We would call him, ask him to come over, and we would tell him everything. Together. "Absolutely, bro. I've got you." The past has a way of lurking in the quiet, nestled between polite silences and cautious eye contact, coiled like smoke in the corners of a room. When we invited him over that night, the house felt unnervingly still. No music, no laughter, just the hum of the fridge and the whisper of a truth waiting to be set free. I could feel it in the walls, the weight of decades of half-truths, of performances so well rehearsed they blurred into reality. And now we were about to unravel it all. My father arrived exactly at 7 p.m. on the dot. He was always punctual, military in his precision, almost as if time was the only thing he could control in a world of shifting narratives. He stepped into the house like a man entering sacred ground that had been desecrated in his absence. His eyes flicked across the space, landing briefly on Vivienne, then on me. He didn't say a word, not even hello. But I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen since childhood. Hesitation, not the kind that came from confusion or forgetfulness, but the kind that bloomed from fear. Vivienne poured tea. I declined. The air didn't need more fuel. We sat in the living room, him on the edge of the couch, me and Vivienne across from him like prosecutors facing a reluctant witness. For a long while, the only sound was the clock ticking behind him, slicing each second into unbearable fragments. "I found him," I said, finally breaking the silence. His gaze lifted, slow and cautious. "Found who?" "My biological father," I said quietly. "His name is Elias Blackwood." There was no gasp, no dramatic collapse, but something in his face shuddered, like a light switch flicked off. He sat still for a moment, then blinked once. "You did a test?" "I did." He inhaled through his nose, nostrils flaring. His shoulders tightened like cords pulling against themselves. "And your mother never told me," he said, more to himself than to us. "She didn't tell me either," I added. "Not until recently. It was hidden, all of it." He was quiet. Then, leaning forward, he asked the question I never expected. "Was he better than me?" The words knocked the breath out of me. All the things I thought he would ask, about timelines, about betrayal, about secrecy, but not that. Not a man comparing himself to a stranger. "I didn't meet him," I said honestly. "I met his son, my half-brother. Elias is dead. He died 4 years ago. Car accident." The shock flickered in his eyes, but he masked it quickly. He looked away, his jaw working like he was chewing on glass. "So it's over," he said. "The story. That chapter." "No," Vivienne said softly. "It's not." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since stepping into the house. "She knows too," I said. "About the adoption, about everything." A silence fell again, thick and disorienting. I watched as his face changed, wrinkled into something too complicated to name. He didn't seem angry anymore. He seemed ancient, like the truth had aged him right before our eyes. "I didn't want this for you," he said finally, voice gravelly. "Any of you. I never wanted this kind of pain." "You didn't cause it," Vivienne replied, but there was a tightness in her tone. "Not directly, but you believed a lie. You loved me like your own, and I'll always be grateful for that. But Lila, you didn't treat her the same. You chose to see her as less." He blinked. "I didn't—" "You did," I interrupted. "You held me to standards you never held her to. You compared us, constantly. You never saw me unless I did something extraordinary, and even then, it wasn't good enough. It was always about her." Vivienne didn't flinch. She let the words hang in the air like sharp blades suspended between us. My father lowered his eyes. His hands trembled slightly against his knees. "I was trying to keep the peace," he said. "Your mother, she was always intense. She needed everything to be perfect. Vivian was easy to love. You were harder to understand. That should have made me feel ashamed, but instead it made me furious. Harder to understand doesn't mean harder to love," I snapped. "I was just different. That didn't make me wrong." "I know," he whispered. "I know that now." But it felt too late, like putting up storm shutters after the hurricane had already ripped the roof off. In the days that followed, things didn't magically repair themselves. There were no movie montage-style reconciliations, no tearful hugs beneath golden sunsets. But something had shifted. A crack in the glacier of silence had formed, and light, thin, tentative, was beginning to seep through. My mother, however, remained unchanged. When we confronted her again, this time with names, dates, and DNA, she reacted not with sorrow, but with indignation. "You had no right," she snapped, "digging into things that don't concern you. Stirring up the past for what? So you can feel superior now." I didn't recognize the woman before me. This wasn't just guilt. It was venom. And beneath it, panic. "You kept the truth from everyone," I said. "You built a castle of lies, and now you're angry we found the basement." She turned to Vivian, eyes narrowing. "And you still have a good life, a career, friends. Why would you throw yourself into her drama?" Vivian stood her ground. "Because it's not drama. It's truth. You hid everything from me, from both of us. You made me believe I was your perfect little mirror when I wasn't even your reflection." The moment shattered something fragile. My mother didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She walked away. That night, she left the house. Suitcase, purse. No goodbye. Vivian and I sat on the front steps after she left, the porch light buzzing faintly overhead. "I think she's gone for good," Vivian murmured. "She'll be back," I said, though I didn't believe it. She always comes back. But days passed, and she didn't. Instead, we received a letter, not an email, not a voicemail, a letter. It was addressed to us both, in her unmistakable script, precise, controlled, the kind of handwriting you'd see on invitations and birthday cards carefully selected by someone who always wanted to appear composed. We read it together. It was 2 pages long, cold, defensive. Not an apology, but a justification. She wrote about how scared she had been when she got pregnant, how Elias Blackwood had been a brief lapse in judgment, a man she never intended to keep in her life, how she convinced herself it didn't matter who the biological father was, because she was building a family, and families are built on choices, not blood. But then came the part that stunned us. "I chose to raise you both in the roles I thought you were best suited for. Vivian was always bright, poised, and easy to mold. You, Lila, were different. I didn't know what to do with different, so I focused on what I could control." I couldn't breathe for a moment. "I'm not proud of all my decisions," she continued, "but I'm not sorry for protecting the version of life I believed would be safest for everyone. You may hate me for that, so be it. But I loved you, each in my own way." It wasn't love, not the kind that heals. It was love that sought to contain. Weeks passed. The weather changed. Autumn leaves replaced the thick heat of summer. The world kept moving. Vivian and I found a rhythm, not as sisters born of the same blood, but as allies bound by the same scar. My father began attending therapy, alone at first, then with me. He was trying, truly trying, and that mattered more than any delayed apology. One day, he brought me a photo. It was old. A man in his 20s standing beside my mother. They weren't touching, but something in the way their shoulders tilted toward each other spoke volumes. "That's him," my father said. "Elias Blackwood. I found this in her box of keepsakes." I traced the edges of the photograph, wondering what kind of man he was, if he ever knew about me, if he would have cared. "I'm glad you found your brother," my father said softly. "I hope he's good to you." "He is," I whispered. "He really is." And yet, the story isn't over. Because healing isn't linear, because identity doesn't settle neatly after one revelation. Because even with all the truths laid bare, I still feel pieces of myself shifting, realigning into someone I don't fully recognize yet. But she's stronger. She's louder. And she refuses to be second best ever again. There's a strange quiet that settles over life when the chaos finally fades. Not the silence of peace, but something heavier, deeper. A hush that follows ruin. Like the air after a house burns down. The smoke has cleared, the flames extinguished, but the foundation is still smoldering beneath your feet. That's where I found myself in the months after the letter. After my mother left, after everything we thought was untouchable, finally fractured beyond repair. Vivian stayed. That was the first surprise. She had every reason to run, every excuse to disappear and rewrite her identity somewhere else. And yet she didn't. Maybe because she needed answers. Maybe because the pedestal she'd been placed on no longer felt like home. We were equals now, not because we'd finally reached the same level, but because we'd both been knocked down far enough to see each other clearly. We began unpacking the past, not all at once, but slowly, like peeling wallpaper from an old room, layer by layer, decade by decade. There were things she'd never known. How our mother used to ignore my questions at the dinner table like I wasn't even speaking. How she once ripped up a poem I wrote and told me not to waste time on dreams. How she smiled so wide when Vivian brought home trophies but looked disappointed when I brought home art. These weren't new revelations, just old scars finally named. But Vivian had her own version of pain. Her world, so long wrapped in the illusion of love, had always been lined with silent pressure, unrelenting expectations, the need to be perfect, the fear that one wrong move would make that love disappear. And now, with the knowledge that she was adopted, that fear had a voice. Had she been loved for who she was, or for how well she performed the role? It wasn't a competition anymore. We were two daughters, both betrayed in our own way. The search for my biological father had ended with a grave, but the story hadn't. My half-brother Colin and I began speaking regularly. Phone calls that started cautious and turned warm, emails that became longer, deeper. He sent me photos of Elias, told me stories I never could have imagined. How he loved jazz, how he used to read the same 3 books every summer, how he proposed to his wife under a Ferris wheel because he was afraid of heights and wanted to prove he could conquer fear. I learned more about myself in those stories than I ever had in my own childhood home. Colin visited once, just once. We had dinner at a small Italian place near my apartment. Vivian came too. I watched the two of them shake hands, siblings by circumstance, strangers with matching blood. There was no awkwardness, just a quiet curiosity, like puzzle pieces gently testing the fit. That night, when Colin left, he hugged me tight and whispered, "You have his eyes." I'd never heard that before. I cried in the parking lot for 20 minutes. As for my mother, the silence stretched. She didn't return. Not for the holidays, not when her sister passed away, not even when Vivian landed a major promotion and made the local paper. There were no more letters, no cryptic messages. She became a ghost, alive somewhere, surely, but removed from our world entirely. We later found out through a third cousin that she'd moved to a coastal town in Oregon. She bought a cottage, lived alone, attended book clubs under a new name. She'd always been good at creating narratives, and in that story, we no longer existed. At first, that abandonment reopened the wounds, especially for Vivian. But time, as it always does, dulled the edges. We stopped waiting for her to come back. We stopped wishing she'd call. Instead, we let her be a chapter we closed. My father, though, surprised us all. He continued therapy. He began volunteering at a local shelter. He started painting, badly, adorably, and even gave me one of his canvases, a crooked interpretation of a lake at dusk. He called it New Beginnings. It now hangs in my hallway, and every time I walk past it, I smile. We rebuilt our relationship slowly, without rushing. He apologized in real ways, not just with words, but with changed behavior. He showed up. He listened. He stopped comparing. He stopped correcting. He simply loved. One night, we sat in his backyard, the fire pit crackling between us, and he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "I was so afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that if I admitted how wrong I was, you'd never forgive me." "I almost didn't," I said honestly. "But you didn't walk away. You didn't hide. He nodded. I just hope I can still be your father. You always were, I said, even when it hurt. And in that moment, something healed. Vivian made the boldest move of all. She changed her last name. Not to Blackwood, not to mine, but to something entirely her own. She said she needed to become someone new, not just react to someone old. She moved into a new apartment, got a dog, and started writing a book about identity. Not a memoir, she said, a story, one she could control. She asked me to read the first draft. It was stunning. She cried when I told her. I cried too. Not because it was sad, but because it was beautiful, because it was hers. As for me, I stopped needing to prove myself. There was a time when I chased validation like a drug, always trying to earn love, to become enough. But now I simply am. I go to work, I host small dinners, I garden, I laugh more, I forgive faster, I sleep deeper. The house we once grew up in was sold. Strangers live there now. They painted the front door red. It's cheerful, almost defiant. I drive by sometimes, not to revisit pain, but to remind myself how far I've come. That house doesn't hold me anymore. It never really did. I hold myself now. The story ends not with a confrontation, not with revenge or retribution, but with clarity, with freedom, with a family reimagined, rebuilt, redefined, not by lies or roles or biology, but by truth, by choice, by love that's earned, not assumed. We were once daughters in a house of silence. Now, we are women in a world of our own making. And that is enough. That is everything.